Imagine a peaceful village, just a few kilometers from Jerusalem, where the voices of the crowds fade away and the sound of the wind cradles the silence of the olive trees. This is the setting of Bethany, a place that at first glance could just be another small village in the vastness of Judea. But for Jesus, Bethany was more than just a simple stop on his journey. It was a refuge, a meeting point, and possibly a strategic center to prepare the unfolding of the last and most important acts of his mission. The question that drives us is, why Bethany? And above all, who was by his side in this sanctuary of faith? Located just 3 kilometers from Jerusalem, Bethany had a unique geographical position. Its proximity to the holy city allowed for quick access to events happening in the capital, but also provided the necessary distance to escape from the pressure and constant surveillance of religious leaders. This balance made Bethany a safe and discreet place, ideal for meetings away from prying eyes. It's no coincidence that Jesus chose this location as the setting for some of the most significant moments of his ministry. But Bethany is not just remembered for its geography. It is inseparable from its most illustrious residents, Lazarus and his sisters, Martha and Mary. These 3 siblings were not just followers of Jesus, they formed a core of deep and unwavering friendship. The Gospel of John makes it clear that Jesus loved this family in a special way. It was not a casual or merely fraternal love. It was a bond of trust, respect, and a unique spiritual connection. This raises the hypothesis that Lazarus's house was not just a welcoming home, but also a meeting point for private and strategic dialogues. The evangelical narrative about Bethany reaches its climax with the resurrection of Lazarus, one of the most impactful events of Jesus' ministry. When Lazarus falls ill, Jesus does not immediately rush to save him. He stays where he is for 2 more days before leaving, a decision that left many perplexed. However, this delay was not negligence, but part of something bigger, a definitive demonstration that Jesus had power not only over illness, but also over death. And it was in Bethany that this truth was revealed to the world. The resurrection of Lazarus had a profound impact on everyone who witnessed or heard about the miracle. It was not just an act of compassion, but a direct proclamation that Jesus was the resurrection and the life. And in this context, Bethany became more than a refuge. It became a symbol of rebirth and hope. But what happened after this monumental event? The house of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary likely transformed into a place of intense spiritual activity, and the interactions there may have shaped Jesus' final steps towards Jerusalem. It's important to reflect on the role of each member of this family. Martha, with her practical nature and sense of responsibility, ensured that everything ran smoothly. Maria, with her contemplative spirituality, symbolized the devoted heart that surrenders itself completely to faith. And Lazarus, reborn from the dead, was not only a living sign of Jesus' power, but a walking testimony that the impossible could be real. Together, they formed a trio that, symbolically, represented different aspects of service to Christ's mission: action, devotion, and transformation. Bethany was also the stage for a significant event, the dinner where Mary anointed Jesus' feet with expensive perfume and dried them with her hair. This gesture is loaded with symbolism and anticipation. While many interpreted it as an act of love and respect, Jesus saw it as a preparation for his imminent death. This moment reinforces the idea that Bethany was a place where the deepest mysteries were shared and understood, even in silence. Another relevant point is that Bethany was not just a place of passage. Jesus often returned to Lazarus' house, even knowing that tension with religious leaders was escalating. This reinforces the idea that he found there a kind of emotional and spiritual stronghold not present elsewhere. It was where he felt understood and supported in his journey of sacrifice. Bethany therefore became more than a physical refuge. It was a spiritual home in a time of uncertainties. Furthermore, the geographical proximity of Bethany to the Mount of Olives a place associated with moments of intense prayer and prophetic revelations, creates a powerful symbolic connection. While the Mount was a place of solitude and reflection, Bethany was the place of sharing and preparation. These two places were interconnected in Jesus' final journey, as if they were two sides of the same mission: contemplation and action. We cannot ignore that, in critical moments of history, spiritual and revolutionary leaders always had support points where they could prepare away from the public eye. Bethany can be interpreted as one of these points, a place where Jesus' message was cultivated and deepened before being taken to the crowds. And just like other masters and leaders throughout history, Jesus knew that his message needed to be nurtured by bonds of trust with people who fully understood his purpose. We conclude this first part with a crucial question: was Bethany chosen randomly, or did it represent an essential piece in the larger plan? The context and the figures involved suggest that it was not mere coincidence. Jesus, a master of spiritual strategy, may have transformed a simple village into a fundamental pillar of his mission. And with that, the provocation remains. Who, besides Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, was part of this more intimate circle? Are we facing a network of silent disciples who dedicated themselves in secret to the divine plan? The word knight brings to mind the image of mounted warriors, defenders of kingdoms, and bearers of honorable missions. However, when we delve into the biblical and historical context, we realize that this figure doesn't need to be understood only in the literal sense. The idea of knights in Bethany can be a powerful metaphor for a group of spiritual initiates, people prepared to carry messages and protect teachings in a strategic and sacred manner. After all, in all eras, spiritual leaders have entrusted their deepest truths to faithful disciples, often invisible to the general public. The concept of knights as defenders of a sacred cause finds its roots in various ancient traditions. In Jewish culture, there were groups known for their dedication and discipline. The Essenes, for example, were an ascetic community that sought purity and believed they played a crucial role in preparing for the kingdom of God. Many scholars argue that John the Baptist, the forerunner of Jesus, may have been influenced by this movement. These movements shared a central characteristic. They were composed of men and women who considered their mission a divine calling, not just a simple social movement. Another example are the Zealots, known for their fight against Roman occupation. Although they were militants in the physical sense, the term zealous carries a deeper connotation: someone fervently devoted to a cause. This makes us wonder if the Knights of Bethany could represent a group less concerned with material battles and more focused on defending the spiritual legacy of Jesus. They would therefore be warriors in a symbolic sense, driven by unwavering faith and a mission to protect and propagate the truth. In the Christian tradition, we also have the figure of the 12 apostles, who are often seen as the guardians of Christ's teachings. However, even within this group, there was a spiritual hierarchy. For example, Peter, James, and John were part of an even more intimate circle, witnessing events that the others did not, such as the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor. This reinforces the thesis that Jesus, at decisive moments, shared his deepest messages with a select trusted group. If this happened among the apostles, why couldn't there be a similar circle in Bethany? Another important point is the symbolism of rebirth. Lazarus, resurrected by Jesus, became a living symbol of victory over death. In some ancient traditions, those who reborn through symbolic initiation rites were given a new mission, a new identity. In this context, Lazarus not only returned to life, but may have received a renewed spiritual purpose. As a knight, he would carry with him a powerful testimony that would reinforce faith and prepare others for the challenges that were to come. Furthermore, there is an interesting aspect related to the role of spiritual guardians: silence. The greatest initiates often maintain a strategic silence, preserving what has been entrusted to them until the right time to reveal it. Bethany, therefore, would not only be a place of miraculous manifestations, but also a space for spiritual training, where lessons of patience, devotion, and humility were reinforced. The family of Bethany may have played this role, not as visible leaders, but as invisible pillars of support. It's also relevant to explore the role of women in the context of this spiritual circle. The figure of Mary of Bethany, kneeling at Jesus' feet and listening to his teachings, is not just an image of devotion, but of deep learning. In the tradition of various mystery schools, women held central roles as oracles and guardians of spiritual truths. Mary may have represented an archetype of an initiated disciple, someone who understood not only the message, but its weight and hidden meaning. The term knight is not directly mentioned in the Bible in relation to followers of Jesus, but the idea of a guardian is recurring. In various passages, there are mentions of those who watch, guard, and protect. This applies to both the physical and spiritual realms. The Knights of Bethany, in this sense, could be interpreted as guardians not only of the physical space where Jesus found rest, but also of the mysteries that he shared with them. Another interesting reflection is the parallel with later spiritual orders, such as the Templars. Although they emerged centuries after the time of Jesus, the Templar Knights symbolized the idea of defenders of the faith and guardians of sacred knowledge. Some scholars suggest that the Templars were inspired by older traditions, possibly linked to stories about the first followers of Jesus. This leads us to ask, could it be that already in the early stages of Christianity, there was a group of people who understood the depth of Jesus' mission and dedicated themselves to protecting and perpetuating these teachings? It's also important to remember that for a spiritual master, discipleship is not just about teaching doctrines. It involves entrusting secrets and missions. Jesus knew that his time on earth was limited. Every word spoken and every action taken in Bethany may have been carefully planned to prepare those around him for the moment when he would no longer be physically present. The Knights of Bethany would then be more than just apprentices. They would be potential missionaries, ready to continue the work on different fronts after the crucifixion and resurrection. Finally, this idea of a strategic circle leads us to reflect on our own journey. We all have a circle of people who strengthen and inspire us, but are we aware of the role we play? Are we merely spectators, or are we willing to be guardians of the truths we consider sacred? The story of Bethany and the hypothesis of a group of initiates around Jesus challenges us to think about our spiritual responsibility and what we are ready to protect and sustain in our journey. If Bethany was a place where silent disciples gained strength for the trials that were to come, perhaps it can inspire us to recognize the Bethanies in our lives, spaces and people who help us to be reborn and carry our own mission with faith. Few events in biblical accounts have as powerful an impact as the resurrection of Lazarus. The moment when Jesus, in front of an astonished crowd, cries out, "Lazarus, come forth," is not just an extraordinary miracle, but a symbolic and strategic declaration that would mark the peak of his mission before the Passion. This event in Bethany carries a depth that goes beyond the spectacle of bringing someone back to life. It encapsulates Jesus' central purpose, the victory over death, and the promise of a new life. But could this rebirth also signify a call to an even deeper mission? Let's start with the scenario. Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. In Jewish culture, it was believed that after 3 days, the soul no longer remained near the body. The 4th day represented the point of no return, the complete separation between body and spirit. By performing the miracle after this period, Jesus was not only bringing someone back to life, but also challenging deeply ingrained beliefs about the irreversibility of death. The resurrection of Lazarus was a clear message. There is no temporal or spiritual limit that can restrain the power of God. But there is something more intriguing. When Jesus performed this miracle, he did not do it immediately upon learning of Lazarus' illness. He remained where he was for 2 more days before leaving for Bethany. Many people wonder, why? The evangelist John himself records that Jesus loved Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. So, what would justify this delay? One possible answer is that Jesus wanted that moment to be not just an act of compassion, but a sign with universal reach, a foreshadowing of his own resurrection. After the miracle, the figure of Lazarus ceases to be just a dear friend and brother. He becomes a living symbol of the promise of eternal life. However, there is something even more curious. After his resurrection, Lazarus remains silent in the biblical accounts. Not a word of his is recorded. This in itself is significant. Someone who experienced death and returned could have incredible stories to tell, but Lazarus remains silent. Why? Some scholars interpret this silence as a sign of humility and reverence in the face of an ineffable mystery. Others believe that Lazarus was shielded, a silent guardian of a greater secret. Here, we return to the hypothesis that Lazarus may have taken on a strategic role after his resurrection. In many spiritual traditions, the one who rebirths is seen as someone who receives a new mission. Lazarus may have become a bearer of a deeper message, the living testimony that death was not the end, and as the carrier of this testimony, he would have to deal with a great burden. It's no wonder that, according to some traditions, the religious leaders of the time also wanted to eliminate Lazarus, as he represented indisputable proof of Jesus' power. Furthermore, the miracle of Lazarus' resurrection occurred close to the Jewish Passover, a period of great significance. The Passover celebrated the liberation of the people of Israel from Egypt, and now in Bethany, a new type of liberation was being proclaimed, the liberation from death itself. By bringing Lazarus back, Jesus was not only anticipating the miracle of his own resurrection, but also provoking a movement of faith and fear that would spread rapidly, leading many to believe in him, but also intensifying the hostility of the religious leaders. The role of Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary, also deserves attention. Martha, always practical and straightforward, was the first to question Jesus. "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her pain was intense, but her faith remained unshaken. Mary, on the other hand, threw herself at Jesus' feet crying. These two reactions show the different aspects of faith: Martha's rational trust and Mary's emotional devotion. Both represent legitimate responses to suffering, but it's important to note that Jesus was deeply moved by their pain, to the point of crying. This moment of humanity also reflects the special connection he had with that family. Lazarus, after being called back to life, emerges from the shadows of the tomb wrapped in bandages. Jesus orders, "Unbind him and let him go." These words are not merely practical, they carry a profound symbolism. Unbinding Lazarus was an act of liberation. He was not just a man restored to physical life, but someone who symbolized the liberation of humanity from the bonds of death and fear. And in this context, he could have been seen as someone with a renewed mission, a true knight of the new covenant, a messenger of hope. Another interesting point is the way this miracle resonated in the narrative of Jesus. Lazarus' resurrection marked a watershed moment. It was the event that solidified the love of many and ignited the deadly hatred of others. The religious leaders, seeing that crowds were beginning to follow Jesus because of the miracle, decided that he could no longer be tolerated. Bethany, which was once a place of welcome, was now in the crosshairs of those who wanted to silence the movement. This reinforces the idea that the circle around Jesus would need strength and faith to face the trials that were to come. Finally, the resurrection of Lazarus leads us to reflect on the power of transformation in our own lives. What does it symbolically mean to come out of the tomb? Often we remain trapped by fears, traumas, and limitations that prevent us from fully living. The story of Lazarus reminds us that, even when everything seems lost, There is a call that invites us to leave the darkness behind and walk towards the light. But it also challenges us to understand that upon being reborn, we are given a responsibility to bear witness to life with greater purpose and courage. If Lazarus truly received a new role in a circle of trust around Jesus, it makes us wonder, what are the calls in our lives that we need to hear? Who is calling us out of our own shadows? Perhaps the true mission of the Knights of Bethany was not just to protect a master, but to carry a greater truth, the certainty that love and faith can resurrect everything we thought was low. Among the most enigmatic and fascinating figures in the narrative of Bethany is Mary, sister of Lazarus and Martha. She appears only a few times in the scriptures, but her actions speak louder than words. Always depicted at the feet of Jesus, Mary embodies a type of devotion that goes beyond the ordinary, a blend of reverence, surrender, and spiritual understanding. But who was Mary of Bethany really? What was her role within this circle of trust around Jesus? Was she among the initiates, understanding deeper aspects of the Master's mission? The first significant mention of Mary occurs in one of the most well-known episodes, when Jesus visits the house of Lazarus and Martha. While Martha is busy preparing everything to welcome the guest of honor, Mary is seated at Jesus' feet, attentively listening to his teachings. Martha, frustrated with her sister's apparent inactivity, questions Jesus, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." Jesus' response is surprising. "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but only one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her." This episode reveals something crucial. While Martha represented service, Mary symbolized contemplation and the pursuit of deep knowledge. Sitting at the feet of a master was, at that time, a posture reserved for disciples, usually men. By allowing Mary to occupy this space, Jesus broke with cultural conventions and demonstrated that she was not just a passive follower, but someone worthy of receiving the highest secrets of his message. This stance reinforces the idea that Mary of Bethany may have been an initiated disciple, part of Jesus' inner circle of trust. Another iconic moment when Maria appears is during the dinner in Bethany, a few days before the crucifixion. During the meal, Maria takes a flask of pure nard perfume, one of the most expensive of the time, and anoints Jesus' feet, wiping them with her hair. The act is immediately criticized by Judas Iscariot, who questions the waste of such a valuable item, suggesting that the perfume could have been sold and the money distributed to the poor. But Jesus defends Maria. "Leave her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial." Here, Maria performs a gesture that transcends the understanding of those present. She seems to anticipate something that not even the apostles fully understood: the imminence of Jesus' death. The anointing with nard was not just an act of devotion, it was a symbolic ritual of preparation. In Jewish culture, the dead were anointed before they were buried. Maria, therefore, demonstrates an intuitive and profound understanding of Jesus' fate, as if she was already aware of what was about to happen. This event further reinforces the thesis that Maria had a unique spiritual sensitivity. While many saw Jesus as a leader and miracle worker, she recognized him as the lamb that would be sacrificed. Her act of anointing not only demonstrated love, but also courage, as at that moment, she accepted the pain that would come with the loss of someone she deeply loved. It is possible that, in her silence and devotion, Maria understood better than many the nature of Jesus' sacrifice. Another fascinating aspect of Maria is how she contrasts with other female figures in the scriptures. Unlike Martha, who is active and verbal, and the Samaritan woman, who questions Jesus in search of answers, Maria seems to find the answers in her contemplative silence. This makes her an archetypal figure of absolute surrender and intuitive faith. She does not seek explanations, she simply surrenders to the mystery and accepts the Master's mission with humility. The symbolism of the nard perfume also deserves emphasis. This oil was considered a luxury item, often associated with the preparation of kings and priests. By pouring the nard on Jesus, Mary was not only honoring him as a master, but also acknowledging him as king and priest. This suggests that her gesture had a prophetic dimension, reinforcing the hypothesis that Mary had a deeper understanding of the divine plan. She was not just a follower, but a key piece in the narrative preparing for the events that were to come. Another relevant point is the use of her hair to dry Jesus' feet. In Jewish culture, a woman would hardly let her hair down in public, as this was seen as an act of great intimacy. By doing this, Mary shows that her relationship with Jesus transcends cultural and social norms. She presents herself as vulnerable and transparent before the one she recognizes as the manifestation of the divine. This gesture, loaded with love and reverence, reinforces the idea that Mary did not fear human judgment, as her devotion was absolute. Some apocryphal traditions and mystical interpretations suggest that Mary of Bethany represents an archetype of a faithful disciple and one initiated into the divine mysteries. According to these interpretations, her silence and gestures spoke louder than any speech. She would be a guardian of the deepest revelations, someone who, through her contemplation, touched truths that others only glimpsed. In this sense, Mary can be seen as an essential link between Jesus and the more subtle aspects of his message. Furthermore, it is interesting to reflect on how Mary of Bethany has been interpreted throughout the centuries. In many Christian traditions, she has been associated with the figure of Mary Magdalene, another woman deeply connected to Jesus' ministry. Although there is no consensus on this identification, the fact that both are described as women of deep faith and devotion reinforces the idea that Jesus formed spiritual circles of trust composed not only of men, but also of women with strategic roles. Finally, Maria of Bethany teaches us about the importance of listening and presence. Her role invites us to reflect on the need to find moments of silence amidst the hustle and bustle of life, to sit at the feet of divine wisdom, and fully surrender to what we consider sacred. If she was part of a closer circle of Jesus, it was not because she possessed titles or special skills, but because of her ability to understand with her heart what many tried to comprehend with their minds. We conclude this section with a reflection. Maria of Bethany shows us that sometimes the greatest mission is not in grand deeds, but in small acts of devotion and courage. And if, in every detail of her story, she challenges us to be more than spectators of the spiritual journey, but active participants, are we ready to listen and respond to the call that is made to us? If Mary of Bethany represents contemplative devotion and spiritual surrender, her sister Martha symbolizes practical action and care for the environment in which faith manifests itself. Often remembered only as the anxious one who questioned Jesus about household chores, Martha has a much deeper and strategic dimension in her presence in the biblical narrative. She was, undoubtedly, a central figure in the dynamics of the circle in Bethany, with a role that transcends domestic functions and becomes a reflection of the necessary balance between faith and service. The first significant episode involving Martha occurs during Jesus' visit to the family home. While Mary remains at the Master's feet, Martha is busy preparing the reception. In a gesture that reveals her exhaustion, she asks Jesus to instruct Mary to help her. Jesus' response, often interpreted as a rebuke, can be seen from another perspective, an invitation to reflection. He acknowledges Martha's dedication, but also reminds her of the importance of not letting herself be consumed by restlessness. This scene reveals to us that Martha was more than just a simple hostess. She was an organizer and protector of the space where Jesus and his disciples could find rest and refuge. Martha's service was not just physical, but spiritual. By preparing the environment, she created the conditions for transcendent moments to occur. We can say that Martha played the role of guardian of this sacred space, ensuring that everything was in order for the divine mission to take place. Martha reappears at one of the most dramatic moments in the narrative: the death of her brother Lazarus. When Jesus finally arrives in Bethany, 4 days after Lazarus' passing, Martha is the first to rush to meet him. Her initial phrase reveals both her pain and her faith. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I also know that whatever you ask of God, He will grant you." At this moment, Martha displays an active and rational faith. She believes in Jesus' power, but also seeks to understand the limits of this power. By affirming her trust, Martha reveals herself to be a mature and conscious woman of faith, who is not afraid to question and seek answers. The following dialogue between Martha and Jesus is one of the most profound passages in the Gospel of John. Jesus declares, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though they die, shall live." And Martha, in one of the most sublime moments of the biblical narrative, responds, "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who was to come into the world." This confession of faith is as powerful as that of Peter when he recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. This places Martha on a high level among the disciples, reinforcing her position as someone who understood Jesus' mission in a deep and clear way. Furthermore, Martha's role during the resurrection of Lazarus is revealing. While Mary stays at home, Martha takes the lead and coordinates the movements. She goes to meet Jesus and later calls Mary to join them. This attitude shows that Martha not only accepted Jesus' spiritual leadership, but also understood her own role as a mediator and a link between her family and the Master. Another significant aspect is the balance that Martha brings to the Bethany circle. Her practical presence complements Mary's contemplative devotion. While Mary symbolized listening and silent surrender, Martha represented action and care. This duality is not a negative contrast, but a harmonization of aspects essential to the spiritual journey. After all, faith without action is incomplete, just as action without faith can become empty and mechanical. Martha also teaches us about the importance of purposeful service. Her role was not secondary or less spiritual. On the contrary, it was fundamental for Jesus' mission in Bethany to be possible. She took care of the physical space so that spiritual revelations could occur without distractions or concerns. In many spiritual traditions, service is seen as a high form of devotion. Martha embodies this idea. Serving is not just a practical task, but an act of love and faith. Moreover, Martha's attitude in dealing with the pain of loss and the expectation of a miracle invites us to reflect on our own relationship with faith. How many times in moments of crisis do we seek answers and struggle to balance our faith with the reality around us? Martha shows us that there is no problem in expressing doubts and pain before God, as long as our faith remains firm in its foundation. Her honesty and courage are examples of a mature and realistic spirituality. Another crucial point is that Martha symbolizes sacred hospitality. In Jewish culture, welcoming someone into your home was considered an act of honor and faith. Martha did not merely receive Jesus as a teacher or friend. She welcomed him as someone who brought with him the divine presence. In this sense, her dedication to preparation was not merely social, but a reflection of her reverence and recognition of the importance of the moment. In the end, it's impossible not to recognize Martha as a strategic figure in the circle of Bethany. She was not just the worried sister, but a leader who knew how to prepare the ground so that the divine presence could be welcomed. Her quiet service and bold faith contributed to making Bethany a space for miracles and profound teachings. Finally, Martha challenges us to rethink our own way of serving. Do we, in our daily lives, manage to balance action with contemplation? Do we lead our lives with purpose and faith, or do we let ourselves be carried away by meaningless rush? Martha reminds us that service, when done with love and purpose, becomes an act of devotion and a bridge to higher spiritual experiences. We conclude this section with the following reflection. Just as Martha prepared Bethany to receive Jesus, we are also called to prepare spaces in our life to welcome moments of revelation and grace. And if, like her, we assume the role of guardians of this space, we will be ready to witness the miracles that can occur in everyday life. Bethany was not just a dusty village where Jesus sought rest after long journeys. Much more than that, it was a place of welcome, a true safe harbor amidst the adversities that intensified as he approached his final mission. In a time when crowds followed each of his steps and religious leaders conspired against him, Bethany stood out as a spiritual fortress, a space where the divine and the human intertwined in harmony. Why did Jesus consistently choose Bethany as his point of return? The answer goes beyond geographical proximity to Jerusalem. Bethany was not just a strategic location in terms of distance, but a place where Jesus found genuine faith, understanding, and unconditional support. There he was not just the miracle worker or the rabbi watched with fascination and suspicion. In Bethany, he was understood and loved in his entirety, not just by the crowd seeking signs and wonders, but by the hearts that grasped the real meaning of his mission. Throughout the scriptures, it is common to find spiritual masters who retreated to places of refuge before facing great challenges. Moses ascended Mount Sinai to meet God and receive the law. Elijah took refuge in the desert before hearing the gentle voice of God. Jesus, before being tempted, spent 40 days in the desert in prayer and fasting. Bethany, in this context, was not just a place of passage, but a space for preparation and spiritual regeneration. It was where he could recharge his strength and share intimate moments with his closest disciples. The emotional context of Bethany also reinforces its symbolism. It was there that the miracle of Lazarus' resurrection occurred, a milestone that anticipated the resurrection of Christ himself. This event transformed the village into a place that witnessed the victory over death, and at the same time, carried with it a foreboding of the approaching sacrifice. The village became a place where the shadow of death was defeated, but also where the shadow of the cross began to cast itself. The dinner in Bethany, held shortly before Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, is a clear example of how the village became a sanctuary of farewell and gratitude. During this dinner, Mary anointed Jesus with nard, in a preparatory act that seemed to anticipate the grim events to come. Lazarus' house thus became, at that moment, a place of transition between the phase of public teachings and the days of suffering and redemption. Bethany, therefore, was not just a physical refuge, but a space where the signs of Jesus' fate were felt with a unique intensity. Another significant aspect is the spiritual protection that Bethany provided. While Jesus faced open and intense opposition in Jerusalem, in Bethany, he found a type of refuge that was not just physical, but emotional and spiritual. People like Lazarus, Martha, and Mary understood the nature of his mission and welcomed him without demanding explanations or demonstrations of power. They did not need signs to believe, they already believed. This type of unconditional faith transformed Bethany into a true home, something rare in the journey of someone who often had no place to rest his head. Furthermore, Bethany was a reminder of the balance between retreat and action. Jesus knew that, to face the weight of his mission in Jerusalem, he needed moments of intimacy, silence, and connection with those who understood him. Just like ancient warriors returned to fortresses to prepare for decisive battles, Bethany was the spiritual stronghold where Jesus strengthened himself before his final journey. This need for refuge and preparation reminds us that even the strongest need moments of rest and renewal. The proximity of Bethany to the Mount of Olives further enhances its symbolism. The Mount, which witnessed Jesus' moments of greatest anguish and prayer, was almost an extension of the emotional sanctuary he found in Bethany. This link between the two places suggests that before the pain, there was a space of love. Before the sacrifice, there was a communion with those who loved him unconditionally. This narrative of contrast shows us the importance of finding places and people who support us when we face our most difficult moments. It is also interesting to reflect on how Bethany could have influenced the disciples themselves. Seeing Jesus being received with so much love and dedication, they witnessed a practical example of sacred hospitality and unwavering faith. Bethany, therefore, was not just a stronghold for Jesus, but also a model of how faith and welcome can transform an ordinary home into a place of divine revelations. Another fascinating detail is the fact that Bethany was the last place where Jesus was before his triumphant entry into Jerusalem and, subsequently, before his ascension to heaven. This reinforces the cyclical and sacred nature of this village in Jesus' journey. It was the starting point for the two most symbolic moments of his ministry: the journey towards crucifixion and the return to the Father after the resurrection. Bethany was not just a point on the map. It was a place of reunion, farewell, and transcendence. Finally, Bethany teaches us something essential. We all need spiritual fortresses in our lives, places and people who welcome us, where we can be ourselves and rediscover our inner strength. Jesus, the Son of God, did not hesitate to seek refuge in a small village, surrounded by friends who loved and understood him. This shows us that the search for refuge and renewal is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. We conclude this part with a reflection. If even the greatest master sought a place of comfort and regeneration before facing his biggest challenges, how can we ignore the importance of these moments in our own lives? Perhaps Bethany invites us to create our own spiritual refuges, spaces where we can rediscover our faith and strength before moving forward. The legacy of the inhabitants of Bethany transcended the geographical and temporal boundaries of that small village. The story of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary resonated not only in biblical accounts, but also in the construction of early Christianity and the understanding of profound themes such as faith, resurrection, and service. The events in Bethany shaped a narrative of rebirth, hospitality, and surrender that inspired generations of followers and became a powerful symbol of the new life that Jesus announced. Let's start with Lazarus, the resurrected. The simple fact of being called back to life made his story an irrefutable testimony of Christ's power. Lazarus was not just a symbol of a physical miracle. He represented the spiritual transformation that Christianity preached: rebirth into a new existence in God. It is no coincidence that, according to later traditions, Lazarus became one of the important leaders of the nascent church. Some apocryphal accounts and writings of the early church fathers suggest that he may have moved to Cyprus or Marseille, taking with him the mission to spread the message of the gospel. The silence of Lazarus after his resurrection was also interpreted symbolically. While many would expect him to tell about what he saw on the other side, his lack of words demonstrates the depth of the mystery of life and death. Early Christianity saw in Lazarus the representation of something greater, the acceptance of the mystery of resurrection, not as something to be explained, but as something to be lived and witnessed with faith. This approach influenced how early Christians understood Jesus' promise, not just a promise of victory over physical death, but a complete transformation of existence. Martha, in turn, left a legacy tied to service and practical faith. The figure of Martha was frequently used by early Christians as an example of balance between action and faith. Her encounter with Jesus, where she affirms her belief that he is the Messiah, became one of the most powerful statements of faith in the New Testament. In early Christianity, this confession was remembered as a model for all those who felt called to serve, but who also needed to ground their service in solid faith. Furthermore, Martha represented Christian hospitality, a core value in the early communities. In the primitive church, homes were the main meeting and worship place. There were no grand temples or physical churches in the early years of Christianity. Instead, faith was lived in domestic spaces, in gatherings around the table, in bread sharing, and in joint prayers. Martha became the archetype of those who opened their homes to welcome the faithful and to create a space where faith could be cultivated. Maria of Bethany, on the other hand, left a legacy tied to absolute devotion and sacrifice. Her act of anointing Jesus with the expensive nard perfume was interpreted by the early Christians as a prophetic act of preparation and complete surrender. In the tradition of the Church, Maria symbolized the ability to recognize the sacred and act with love, even when the world around did not understand. Her posture at the feet of Jesus was associated with the role of the ideal disciple, one who listens with the heart and surrenders to the Master's call without hesitation. In the early Church, the memory of Mary also served as a counterpoint to rampant activism. While many sought to engage in actions in the name of faith, the figure of Mary reminded of the importance to stop, listen, and worship. Her example reinforced that action and devotion needed to walk together, but that contemplation and surrender were the source of all strength to serve. The implicit message was clear: the disciple cannot serve well if they do not first know how to be at the Master's feet. It's interesting to note that, in various regions, local traditions have emerged surrounding Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. In Cyprus, for example, there is an ancient tradition that claims Lazarus lived there as a bishop for many years, witnessing the gospel through his example of restored life. Meanwhile, in Marseille, France, medieval accounts associated Mary of Bethany with an itinerant preacher who inspired crowds with her faith and testimony. Although there is no historical consensus on these stories, they demonstrate the enduring impact of the inhabitants of Bethany on the collective memory of Christianity. Another interesting point is that the miracle of Lazarus' resurrection directly influenced the early Church's imagination about the final resurrection of the dead. In the Apostles' sermons and the texts of the early Christians, Lazarus' rebirth was often cited as a foreshadowing of what was to come, the resurrection of all those who believed in Christ. Lazarus thus became a living sign of the final victory over death. His name was associated with hope in times of persecution, when early Christians were led to martyrdom believing that, just like Lazarus, they too would be called back to eternal life. Martha, Maria, and Lazarus also influenced the organization of the first Christian communities. Many scholars believe that the model of small communities centered around homes was inspired, in part, by the dynamics of Bethany. The house of that family was a meeting point not only for moments of rest, but for moments of revelation. This concept of a domestic church was fundamental for the growth of the Christian faith during its early years and was perpetuated as a symbol of the importance of familial and communal communion. Furthermore, the concept of faith expressed through concrete acts of hospitality and devotion was a direct reflection of Jesus' interaction with the siblings of Bethany. Generosity, service, and silent worship became essential elements of the Christian identity, inspired by those moments when the Master was welcomed into an ordinary home, but filled with extraordinary faith. We conclude this part with the following reflection. The legacy of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary is not just in the events they lived alongside Jesus, but in the eternal lessons they left about service, faith, and contemplation. They teach us that, in the spiritual journey, there is no small role or insignificant gesture. Everything that we do with faith and love can become part of a powerful testimony that transcends generation. The story of Jesus and his circle in Bethany leads us to reflect on a universal pattern present in various spiritual traditions throughout history. The relationship between masters and their closest disciples, often organized into small and select groups. These circles, often referred to as initiates, are not mere passive followers, but active participants in the mission and in the dissemination of the deepest truths. Bethany, with Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, presents strong parallels with other traditions where the transmission of transcendent knowledge occurs in an environment of trust, love, and sacredness. When we observe other historical and spiritual figures, We find situations similar to the dynamic that Jesus cultivated with those around him. Socrates, the famous Greek philosopher, had faithful disciples, such as Plato and Xenophon, who absorbed his lessons not only through public debates, but also in more intimate dialogues. Socrates knew that true learning could only happen when the disciple was willing to question their own beliefs and open themselves to a new understanding of truth. Similarly, Jesus not only taught in public, but reserved private moments with his closest disciples and friends, revealing secrets about his mission and preparing them for the future. Another fascinating parallel can be drawn with Buddha and his community of disciples, the Sangha. Just as Jesus had Bethany as a place of rest and transmission of teachings, Buddha often gathered in monasteries and tranquil clearings, where he shared his teachings with a faithful group of followers. In both cases, the deepest and most transformative teachings were shared with those who had undergone a process of spiritual growth and maturation. It was not just about hearing words of wisdom, but about absorbing lessons through coexistence and constant practice. Another notable example is found in the mystery traditions of ancient Egypt, where priests and disciples were initiated in degrees. Knowledge was not handed out indiscriminately, but conveyed gradually as the initiate proved ready to understand deeper truths. This initiation process required emotional, mental, and spiritual preparation. Bethany seems to reflect this dynamic. It was not just a home, but a space where trust and fellowship allowed extraordinary revelations to occur. Early Christianity was also influenced by this idea of inner learning circles. In the first Christian communities, there were different levels of understanding. The catechumens, those who were preparing for baptism, did not have immediate access to all teachings and rituals. Only after baptism and a deeper spiritual formation were they introduced to the mysteries of faith, such as the Eucharist. This model reflects the logic that certain aspects of spirituality require more intimate preparation and a heart willing to bear the weight of this knowledge. Furthermore, we can draw parallels with the orders of Sufi masters in Islam, where the master, sheikh, guides his disciples through a path of renunciation, love, and inner wisdom. In many accounts, encounters with the Sufi master occur in spaces of great simplicity and communion, very similar to the atmosphere of Bethany. Humble homes, surrounded by a sense of the sacred that did not depend on grand constructions, but on the presence of the divine in human relationships. Another interesting point of convergence is the fact that, just like Lazarus, Mary, and Martha in Bethany, many disciples of great spiritual masters played complementary roles in their missions. There were those who served through the word, those who witnessed through example, and those who supported the mission with service and hospitality. This pattern of complementarity reinforces the idea that no disciple is called to be merely a spectator, but rather an active piece in the fulfillment of a larger plan. It is also relevant to mention the Essenes, a Jewish sect known for their communal life and spiritual discipline. Although the accounts about them are fragmented, the Essenes cultivated the idea of sanctuaries where they could live away from the corruption of the world, dedicating themselves to the study of the scriptures and prayer. Some scholars suggest that Jesus might have been exposed to Essene practices, and Bethany, in a way, reflects a similar concept of a sacred space, where he and his friends could retreat from tensions and prepare spiritually for the next steps of their mission. Another powerful parallel comes from Christian monastic orders, such as the Benedictines, which emerged centuries later, inspired by the example of Christ and his disciples. Just like in Bethany, hospitality was one of the pillars of these communities, which welcomed travelers and pilgrims in search of rest and renewal. The Benedictine motto, Ora et Labora, pray and work, resonates with the dynamic seen between Martha and Mary. Contemplative prayer and active service intertwine to create a life of balance and purpose. These parallels lead us to an intriguing reflection. Why have so many spiritual masters throughout history fostered circles of trust and sanctuaries where deeper teachings were shared? A possible answer is that the spiritual journey is, by nature, filled with challenges that require moments of preparation and mutual support. Just as warriors needed fortresses to regroup and reorganize, spiritual leaders and their disciples required welcoming and renewing spaces to sustain their missions. Bethany, therefore, was not merely a passive backdrop. It was a strategic piece in Jesus' journey. It was a reminder that even the greatest masters need a place where they can be welcomed, understood, and strengthened. These havens teach us that, just like the great initiates, we too need a space where we can listen, learn, and prepare to face life's challenges with renewed faith. We conclude this part with a question. Amidst the fast-paced rhythm of our lives, are we dedicating time to create or seek our spiritual refuge? If Bethany inspires us with its example, perhaps it's time to reflect on which intimate circles we cultivate and which masters we choose to listen to, and above all, if we are ready to become guardians of something G. Bethany occupies a crucial place in Jesus' final journey, not only as the setting for intimate moments with dear friends, but also as a starting point for the most significant acts of his mission. It was from Bethany that Jesus set out for his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, and it was also in Bethany, according to the Gospels, that he spent his final moments before the Ascension. Thus, the village becomes a symbol of the beginning and end of a cycle, the manifestation of divine love through sacrifice, and the definitive victory with the resurrection and ascension. The triumphant entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, celebrated today as Palm Sunday, was an event laden with symbolism. Jesus, coming from Bethany, chose to enter riding on a donkey, an act that harkens back to messianic prophecies, but also reflects the humility of his mission. He did not come as an armed conqueror, but as a king of peace. Bethany, the humble village without political status, becomes the starting point of this journey of humility and glory. This suggests that Jesus not only found refuge in Bethany, but also a spiritual anchor from which he drew strength to face the weight of what was to come. Another emblematic moment that reinforces Bethany's connection with Jesus' final mission is the dinner at Simon the leper's house. This dinner, mentioned in the Gospels, directly preceded the Passion and was marked by the symbolic act of Mary of Bethany anointing Jesus with pure nard. As seen earlier, this gesture was not just a demonstration of love and respect, but a prophetic preparation for his imminent death. At that moment, Bethany ceased to be just a place of reunion and became a place of farewell, where those closest to Jesus began to perceive, even if in a fragmented way, the tragic fate that was approaching. After the crucifixion and resurrection, Bethany reappears powerfully. According to the Gospel of Luke, it was in this village that Jesus had his last physical encounter with the disciples before his ascension. And he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he blessed them, he was taken up into heaven. Luke 24:50-51. The image of Jesus blessing his followers in Bethany reinforces the idea that this place was more than a temporal refuge. It was a sanctuary where the most sacred and transcendent aspects of his mission unfolded. This final act in Bethany carries profound significance. It was there that Jesus concluded his earthly mission, confirming to the disciples that his journey did not end with the cross, but with the ascension to the Father. Bethany, therefore, became the last point of human contact before heavenly glory. By choosing Bethany for this moment, Jesus also reinforces the importance of those who walked by his side with unwavering faith. He did not say goodbye in Jerusalem, the center of political and religious power, but in Bethany, among humble friends and followers. The choice of Bethany as the final stage of blessings and farewell symbolizes the appreciation of love, fellowship, and simple faith, which do not require large structures or ceremonies. The implicit message is clear. Spiritual grandeur manifests itself in the simplest places, in the most sincere gestures, and in the most authentic relationships. This invites us to reflect on the essence of our own spiritual journey. Are we seeking the divine in large external manifestations, or are we attentive to the subtle signs of love and faith around us? Furthermore, the fact that Bethany is close to the Mount of Olives, where Jesus spent moments of deep prayer and agony before being arrested, creates a strong emotional contrast. If the Mount of Olives witnessed the climax of Jesus' pain and surrender, Bethany witnessed the confirmation of the promise of victory and renewal. It's as if the two locations were complementary pieces of the same destiny, one representing human vulnerability in the face of suffering, and the other, restoration and full communion with God. Bethany's inner circle also reveals to us that Jesus did not face his journey alone. Even in his moments of greatest anguish, he had around him people who understood, albeit partially, the magnitude of his mission. The bond with Lazarus, Martha, and Mary reminds us that even the Savior needed sincere friendships, a welcoming space, and people willing to walk alongside him, even when they did not fully understand the path. Another important point is that, in many Christian traditions, Bethany has come to be seen as an archetype of a domestic church, a space where faith was lived in community and where the divine presence manifested itself in the intimacy of familial and spiritual bonds. The house of Lazarus and his sisters became a model for what the early Christian communities desired to be, a place of gathering, sharing, and profound faith. In Bethany, there were no political disputes or the grandeur of temples. There was a simple home, but one filled with love and hospitality. The end of Jesus' journey in Bethany reminds us that the Ascension was not a final farewell, but a continuation. The blessing he gave to the disciples at that moment was a sign that, even without his physical presence, his mission would continue through them. Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, as well as the apostles, were witnesses not only to the suffering, but to the glory that was revealed in the end. This reinforces the idea that those who remain faithful in times of trial are also called to partake in the final victory. Finally, Bethany teaches us that every great journey needs a starting and returning point. Just as Jesus began his last journey there and returned to bless his disciples before the Ascension, we too need to identify what are the Bethanys in our lives, places and people that offer us renewal, understanding, and faith. The legacy of Bethany challenges us to reflect on where we seek our spiritual refuge and with whom we share the most decisive moments of our journey. We conclude with the following reflection. Bethany was not a stage for major public events, but it was the setting for some of the most intimate and significant moments in the story of Jesus. This shows us that, on our journey, the moments of greatest transformation may not happen in front of crowds, but rather in simple places, among people who truly know and love us. Before we wrap up Mind Unfettered, I want to hear from you. What is your Bethany, that place or group of people where you find refuge, faith, and renewal? Share it in the comments. By sharing your experiences, you're not just telling your story, you're helping create a space of collective reflection where others can also find inspiration and support. Imagine the power of hundreds of people sharing their Bethanys right here. Together, we can create a ripple effect of faith and comfort that crosses boundaries. Your story matters and could be the refuge someone else needs. And the journey doesn't end here. If you're intrigued by the idea of spiritual guardians and hidden mysteries, you can't miss the next video. The Guardians of the Grail, the hidden secret of Jesus and his divine lineage. Click on the screen now and dive even deeper into the hidden stories surrounding Jesus and his divine legacy. See you there, Mind Unfettered. Together, we continue awakening our spirituality and uncovering the sacred mysteries of the journey.